Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Exactly a week ago on the 12th of January, my guest in a special briefing to the United States Congress warned, and I'm quoting him, genocide could very well happen in India. And he wasn't simply alluding to those blood-curdling calls for Muslim genocide and ethnic cleansing made in December from a Dharm Sansad in Hardwar. He was also referring to a series of events and developments that go back 20 years. Joining me now to better and fully explain his concerns is the founding president of Genocide Watch, Dr. Gregory Stanton. Dr. Stanton, on the 12th of January, in a briefing to the United States Congress, you said, and I'm quoting you, "We are warning that genocide could very well happen in India." Could I start by asking you, why do you believe that to be the case?
Yes. Our view is at Genocide Watch that a lot of the early warning signs in India are early warning signs of genocide. And we've learned over the years that we should not ignore these early warning signs. We knew that there were very early warning signs, for instance, in Rwanda, 5 years ahead of the time when the genocide there happened. We warned, no one did anything about it. We tried to even warn the president of the country. But the reason we try to warn is because our objective is prevention. If you warn after the genocide is over, it's too late. And unfortunately, that's usually been the response of most of the international community. And I would add that we're not the only ones warning. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum, which has a genocide prevention center, is also warning that India is in fact the second most likely country to have genocide in this coming year.
Can I ask you, what are the early warning signs that attracted your attention and are the cause of your concern?
We use a model called the 10 stages of genocide. These are really processes, not stages. I shouldn't have used the word stages because it has a linear aspect. But these are processes that contribute to genocide, that make it possible for it to happen. The first is classification, in which you distinguish between us and them, you other people. And in India, as we well know, Hindus are distinguished from Muslims, Christians, members of other religions, and so forth. Classification itself is not, an act of genocide. In fact, it's normal human behavior. It's how we classify the world. But when it is used in a harmful way to classify an entire group as other than us, as aliens, for instance, then it can become one of those processes that leads to genocide. The second thing is symbolization. You can recognize people by their clothes, the places they worship, their rituals, their rules for marriage, and so forth. Again, that doesn't necessarily lead to genocide. It's only when those symbols are used to facilitate genocide in ID cards, for example, or in markings on houses, or making people wear yellow stars and so forth. The third thing, discrimination, we can see in the Citizenship Amendment Act, which gave preference for asylum in India to refugees from specific religions, from Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, but it deliberately excluded Muslims. And the goal is deportation of many Muslims, at least 3 million, from Bangladesh in 1971, who came to Bangladesh during that civil war. The next is dehumanization, in which you have the Home Minister of India calling Muslims termites, in which the Bangladesh Muslim refugees are called foreigners or aliens who should be sent back to Bangladesh or go to Pakistan. We also have organization, the RSS, very well organized, of course, and it's been neo-Nazi since its beginning. In fact, the founder of the RSS was a great admirer of Hitler. We also, of course, have the leader of the BJP, Mr. Modi himself, who is a member of the RSS. And when he was chief minister of Gujarat, a massacre of Muslims occurred in which at least 1,000, probably more than that, were massacred and killed. And he did nothing. And in fact, there's evidence that he may have stood by intentionally and told his police not to interfere. We also, of course, have the Indian Army and the police in Kashmir, 600,000 troops in Kashmir, and the revocation of autonomy for Kashmir. We have polarization. We have the propaganda, false propaganda about a love jihad, for example, in which, and we have laws against intermarriage, laws against conversion, religious conversion, a direct violation, I think, of freedom of religion. We have lynchings. We also have preparation, in which we have a census law that's been passed in India to make people prove their citizenship. When you try to make people prove their citizenship so you can strip them of their citizenship, and that's the idea here. If they can't produce enough documents that they were citizens of India before 1971, they're considered foreigners and they can be deported. And that's exactly what this government has announced it plans to do with the at least 3 million people who now live in Assam who are Muslims. And we also have persecution. We have lynchings. We have attacks on churches. We have attacks on mosques. We have arrests of Bengali Muslims in Assam. We have oppression of Kashmiri Muslims. So all of those early warning signs are already there. We don't say that the next stage, which is extermination, has begun yet. But our view is that it is a huge danger in India because it won't be the state that carries out any genocide. It will be mobs. It will be the same kinds of mobs that carried out double genocide at the time of partition in 1947.
This is very important because, as you said to the US Congress, genocide is not an event, it's a process, it develops. And the 10 stages of genocide, which your organization Genocide Watch has identified, are the different stages of that process. And you believe India is pretty far down that list of 10 stages. You identified classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, polarization, and we're getting perilously close, in your opinion, to actual extermination, which is why you're seriously worried today.
That's right. And by the way, I'm also seriously worried about many other countries, as you can imagine. I even believe that genocide is possible in the United States. After all, we committed genocide against our own Native Americans. We committed genocide against African Americans during the slave trade. This is a country that has committed genocide. Just because it's a democracy doesn't mean it's impossible. And so that's why I'm so worried about India, because this is a country with a constitution that works, with a constitution that could stop it. And I hope it will. I hope people will tell Mr. Modi, no, you can't do this. You can't keep up this hatred here in this country. We have, as you know, just had a president who also was a preacher of hatred, Mr. Trump, and he polarized this country. I'm worried that the same thing could happen in India.
You said a very important thing, and I'm underlining it. You said just because a country is a democracy doesn't mean genocide cannot happen within that country. And this is why you're so particularly concerned about Kashmir and Assam. Again, I'm going to quote from what you said to the US Congress. You said, right now, it would be hard to say there is a genocide in Kashmir or Assam, but what there are is the early signs and processes of genocide in Kashmir and Assam. Those are the two states where you are most worried that the likelihood of genocide is steadily growing.
That's right. And we're about to issue another genocide warning, but this is for Uttarakhand. because as you know, that is where this conference in Hardwar occurred, where Hindu extremist leaders were in fact calling for Hindus to arm themselves to kill Muslims. They said it outright, blatantly. We must arm to kill Muslims. That is the sort of hate speech, that, well, it's called incitement to commit genocide, actually. It's a crime. Under the Genocide Convention, incitement to commit genocide is an act of genocide. These people should be prosecuted for that.
Now, you also said something else. You said the US Holocaust Memorial Museum believes that India is the second most likely country to see a genocide. Does Genocide Watch, your organization, also believe that India is the second most likely country in the world to see a genocide?
Well, actually, we don't try to rank countries, in orders of probability, and the reason the US Holocaust Memorial Museum does is they use a statistical model as a risk analysis that's how they can say this is the second most likely. We have never tried to be that exact, but what we do know is this, that our model works. We are one of the most predictive organizations, have predicted every single genocide since we were founded in 1999. But the Holocaust Museum is also a very distinguished organization, as you know. And so they use a different model, a statistical model, but it completely agrees with our predictions.
Let me at this moment focus a little particularly on the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In your briefing to the US Congress on the 12th of January, you spoke specifically about Narendra Modi, and you made 2 points about him. You said you believe that he encouraged the 2002 massacre when 1,000 Muslims are believed to have been killed in Gujarat when he was chief minister. And you also said that he uses anti-Muslim rhetoric to build his political base. Now, Mr. Modi and the BJP will strenuously and angrily refute that. But the point I want to ask you is this: why did you believe it was important to make these points to the US Congress, specifically about the Indian Prime Minister?
Well, the reason is I think he has a record he needs to answer about. He needs to be accountable. In 2002, and when he was chief minister of Gujarat, and there were these massacres of Muslims, at least 1,000 died. He stood back, and there's evidence, quite a bit of evidence, that he really told his police not to intervene. So that's complicity, at the very least, in genocidal massacres. So he has a record. Not only that, he's a member of the RSS. The RSS has been a hate group from the beginning. In fact, it was an RSS member who assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, as you know. And now, in fact, some of the RSS leaders are even celebrating Godse, the assassin of Gandhi. It's extraordinary, and it's amazing. It's like celebrating, John Wilkes Booth, who was the assassin of Lincoln. So that's one thing. But secondly, and I do believe this, I think that the BJP, Modi, and his followers and other people in BJP are using this to build their Hindu base, their political base, just the way Trump has tried to use hatred of immigrants and other people who are so-called aliens to build his political base here in the United States. So I'm very worried about that, because when you try to set one group against another in order to build a political base, it creates the basis on which genocide is likely to happen.
Now, in your deposition to the US Congress, you said, and again, I'm quoting you, Modi has a moral obligation to denounce hate speech. Exactly a month has passed since those blood-curdling calls for genocide were made in Hardwar. And Mr. Modi hasn't said a word. Leave aside denounce, he hasn't said a word. Is his silence another reason why you chose to particularly talk about him to the US Congress?
Indeed, it is. He is, after all, Prime Minister of India. And although it is state authorities who need to arrest, for instance, the inciters to genocide who spoke at Hardwar, it's, in other words, a state responsibility. Nevertheless, he as prime minister, he's the leader of the country. I think he has a moral obligation to denounce this kind of hate speech, just as I believe our current president, Mr. Biden, has been denouncing this kind of hate speech finally in the United States. Leaders have a responsibility to not remain silent when their countries are at grave risk of violence. And I believe that is his duty as the president, as the prime minister of India. India has a really great constitution, a constitution that works. I spent a year living in India at the Indian Law Institute, and I was so impressed with how India and its legal system works. And the independence of the judiciary, the extraordinarily complex society that India is, with its such great diversity. To have someone attack that, to actually have people in his party who would like to target Muslims, I think is against the very nature of India. It's against the Constitution of India.
Then can I ask you this? How do you interpret Mr. Modi's silence? And I'll just repeat something I said earlier. It's not a silence of a day or a week. He's been silent for a month. How do you interpret that silence?
Let me quote my leader, Martin Luther King Jr. I have spoken on the same platform as him when I was just a college student. And I've met him, and I was trained by his organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and was a civil rights worker in Mississippi. Martin Luther King once said, "We will know who is against us, not by what they have said, but by their silence." And I think that kind of silence is what we're seeing now from Mr. Modi. It's time for him to condemn this kind of hatred in India.
But you're also saying by implication that Mr. Modi's silence damns him.
Oh, yes. Oh, it sure does. Absolutely.
I just want to point out to the audience that you have an unerring capacity to sense genocide long before it happens. I believe in 1989, 4 or 5 years before it happened in Rwanda, you were living there and you went and met the president at the time and said to him, if you don't take action to remove the way ethnicity is stamped on identity cards, you will have a genocide in your country. And 4 or 5 years later, that is precisely what happened. And so when you have that same gut instinct about India, you have a track record of being correct. And therefore, your gut instinct about India is particularly ominous and worrying. Have I correctly interpreted that?
You have indeed, in fact. Yes. In fact, I'd noticed these ID cards that has Tutsi and Hutu and Twa and naturalized on them, written right on them. And I had dinner one night with Joseph Kabaruganda, who was the president of the Supreme Court, a Hutu, a liberal Hutu. And I said, can't you declare this, denotation of ethnicity on the ID cards to be unconstitutional, some kind of violation of equal protection or something? He said, no, we don't have judicial review in Rwanda. You have to go meet with the president and get this, brought up. So I got a meeting with President Habyarimana himself. And I went in and we talked. I was there to, also to work on making the legal system work better. And one of the things I recommended, by the way, was to recreate the Gacaca system of traditional justice, which later, of course, occurred. But when we got to the ID cards and to the dangers that I saw in genocide in Rwanda, and I also had conducted a workshop on genocide when I was there. I said, you got to get these ethnicities off the ID cards. And at that point, a kind of mask went down over his face, and he didn't want to hear this. It turned out, of course, he had himself conducted genocidal massacres in Rwanda. So I was talking to the wrong man. But 5 years later, exactly, is when the genocide began in Rwanda. And, you know, the other thing is the whole phenomenon of denial, which is always the final stage, by the way, in every genocide, but it also occurs all the way through the process. And a lot of people outside a country will deny that it's likely, and inside a country. Well, I knew that. I saw that right in the State Department during the Rwandan genocide, because I was working in the State Department at that time. And what we had was a legal office in the State Department that refused to use the word genocide. And, you know, Prue Bushnell, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, asked Joan Donahue, who was, you know, leading at that time the deciding factor on whether it should be called genocide. Prue Bushnell asked her, how many deaths does it take until you can say it's genocide? And I quote, Joan Donahue said, we don't have enough evidence of intent. Now, at that time, 10,000 people a day were being killed. Joan Donahue is now the president of the International Court of Justice. That should send shivers up and down your spine, because she is the president of the court that is going to decide the case of Gambia versus Myanmar, in which Myanmar is accused of violating the Genocide Convention.
Quite right.
She's a genocide denier.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but I want to go back once again to what you said to the US Congress exactly a week ago on the 12th of January. You said, and I'm quoting you, that your aim was to brief people who can do something about the threat of genocide in India. What is it that you want the US Congress to do?
I would like the US Congress to pass a resolution. It's much less important than some kind of law, but a resolution that warns that genocide should not be allowed to occur in India, that it should be US foreign policy to prevent it, and that President Biden should warn Mr. Modi and the rest of the Indian government that it must not happen in India. India is a natural ally of the United States because we're both very large democracies. But our president should tell Mr. Modi, if a genocide occurs in your country, in India, it will require us to reassess all of our relationships with India. And I mean, that includes everything, trade and everything. I think we should be doing that very thing with China, as we've already begun, as you know. We now have a law outlawing the importation of any goods that are made in Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur people live. And they are now victims of genocide at the hands of the Chinese government. I think we should be, frankly, boycotting all the sponsors of the Winter Olympics in China because of what China is doing.
Can I ask you this? How confident are you that the US Congress will pass the sort of resolution you believe is necessary, calling upon the president to warn the Indian Prime Minister?
I think it's likely, actually. I think that my experience has been that nobody in Congress really favors genocide. We had a resolution in 2016 that we promoted. It was a resolution about ISIS committing genocide against Yazidis, Christians, Shia, and so forth. At the time, in fact, there were people who said, oh, no, we shouldn't be doing this and so forth. And we said, yes, we should. We should be declaring calling a spade a spade. And we got it passed unanimously in the US Congress and Senate. And in turn, then the Secretary of State declared it. And the result was that we greatly increased our military pressure on ISIS. We defeated them.
But can I interrupt?
Yes.
Passing a resolution against ISIS is a very likely step that the US Congress would take.
Sure.
Do you really believe that the US Congress will take this step vis-a-vis India and Modi?
I don't know if, well, of course, it's not nearly as, for one thing, ISIS was already committing genocide. And I'm not saying that India is now committing genocide. We're only warning that it could happen. So I don't think it's as likely as with ISIS. But I think that the point is that Congress needs to warn, and there will be counter pressures, especially business pressures, because after all, we are very much connected to India in business.
Okay, my last question. If, and I think this is very, very likely, the Modi government and the BJP turn around and say that what you said to me and what you said to the US Congress on the 12th of January is gross exaggeration. And if they go one step further, which I also think is likely, that they denounce you for stirring trouble and making mischief and being prejudicial, how will you respond?
I would respond simply that people have said that about Genocide Watch before, when we predict genocide. And in every case, the prediction has turned out to be true. And we also have not said that genocide's already occurring. We are not trying to exaggerate this at all. We're just saying the early warning stages are there. So stop the genocide now before it is fully underway. And I do think, as I say, that it won't be the state that commits genocide in India. It will be mobs. So that's what we need to worry about. And it's what we need to warn Mr. Modi and others about. I don't think I'm trying to make trouble in India. For goodness sake, I love India. In fact, I dearly love India. And I just hope India will succeed as a nation, and I'm sure it will.
Dr. Stanton, thank you very much for speaking to me. I hope what you said is widely heard in my country and also listened to attentively by my government. Take care.
You.
Stay safe.
Thank you. It's been an honor.